The wisest man who ever lived died a fool. Not my words. God's verdict. Solomon received wisdom directly from God. Not from a teacher. Not from years of study. God appeared to him at night and said, "Ask for whatever you want." And Solomon asked for wisdom. And God gave it along with wealth and honor that no king before him ever had, and no king after him would ever reach. That same man years later was burning incense to Molech, a god that demanded child sacrifice. The same hands that laid the foundation of God's temple were building altars for demons on the hills outside Jerusalem. How do you go from that to that? That question has haunted me for years. And when I finally traced every detail the Bible actually gives us, the architecture, the gold, the women, the slow erosion of a heart that once belonged entirely to God, I found something I wasn't expecting. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. It happened one compromise at a time. One palace wing at a time. One wife at a time. One altar at a time. In this video, we are going inside Solomon's world. The palace that took 13 years to build. The room where 500 gold shields hung on cedar walls, not for war, but for intimidation. The throne guarded by 14 lions of solid gold. The 666 talents of gold arriving every single year. And the 1,000 women who, one by one, pulled the wisest man in history away from the only thing that made any of it mean something. This channel exists to go where most Bible content never goes. Subscribe and stay with me. Because this story doesn't start with gold. It starts with stone. It starts with a number the Bible slips in quietly, almost as if it doesn't want you to notice. 7 years. That is how long it took Solomon to build the temple of God. 7 years of labor. 7 years of cedar from Lebanon. 7 years of stone quarried and shaped and carried up the hill to Jerusalem. Then the very next chapter, 1 Kings, chapter 7, verse 1, the Bible says this: Solomon was building his own house 13 years, nearly twice as long. The house of God, 7 years. The house of Solomon, 13. The Bible doesn't editorialize. It just puts those two numbers next to each other and lets you sit with them. I have sat with them for a long time. Because here is what those numbers tell you about a man. When something truly matters, you finish it fast. Solomon finished God's house in 7 years. Then he spent the next 13 on his own. That is not an accident. That is a priority made visible in stone. The palace complex was not a single structure. It was a city within a city, multiple buildings, multiple courtyards, each one connected, each one built to a standard no architect of that era had ever attempted. The house of the Forest of Lebanon, the Hall of Pillars, the Hall of the Throne, the residential palace, and a separate house built specifically for one woman, the daughter of Pharaoh. 5 distinct structures, all connected, all enclosed within massive courtyards. The foundation stones alone, between 4 and 5 meters in length, single blocks, quarried from the earth, shaped with precision tools, transported across difficult terrain. Think about what it takes to move a stone that size without cranes, without engines. Hundreds of men on ropes, wooden rollers, months just for the foundation. And between every 3 courses of stone, 1 course of cedar beams. 3 rows of stone, 1 row of cedar. All the way up. A construction technique that absorbed seismic movement, that gave the structure flexibility without sacrificing strength. These were not men guessing. These were engineers. The workforce, 30,000 men from Israel rotating through Lebanon, cutting cedar. 70,000 carriers. 80,000 stone cutters in the hills, 3,300 supervisors, over 180,000 people involved at the height of construction. This was the single largest organized human effort the ancient Near East had ever seen. But the scale is only half the story. Because Solomon wasn't just building something functional. He was building a message. In the ancient world, your palace was your resume. The size of your stones told every visiting king how many workers you could command. The quality of your cedar told them how far your trade networks reached. When a delegation arrived from Egypt, from Arabia, from the kingdoms of the East, they didn't just come to talk. They came to read the building, to calculate, in their own minds, what it would cost to go to war against a man who could build this. The answer was always the same: too much. 13 years. 180,000 workers. Foundation stones the size of modern shipping containers. Cedar from mountains 400 kilometers away. All of it saying one thing, without a single word: you cannot afford to be my enemy. But the palace walls were just the container. What Solomon put inside those walls is what made kings fall silent when they walked through the door. And it started in the largest room in the complex, a room the Bible calls by a name that still stops me every time I read it. The house of the Forest of Lebanon. A forest. Built by a man. In the middle of a desert city. Imagine walking into a forest. Not outside. Inside. You pass through the gate, cross the outer courtyard, and enter the largest single structure Solomon ever built. The first thing you see rising from the floor to the ceiling, row after row, are cedar columns. 45 of them. 3 rows of 15. Each one cut from the mountains of Lebanon, transported hundreds of kilometers, erected here in the middle of Jerusalem like a force that refused to acknowledge it was indoors. Ceiling, cedar beams. Walls, cedar. Floor, cedar. The smell alone would have been overwhelming. That deep, resinous smell of cedar that doesn't fade for decades. You are not standing in a room. You are standing inside a living argument, a man telling the world, I brought the forest to the desert, and I did it because I could. 44 meters long, 22 meters wide, 13.5 meters high. Square windows on each side, perfectly aligned, light entering from both directions simultaneously, crossing the entire width of the room, catching those columns, moving across the floor as the sun moved. But this was not just a room for feeling things. This was an arsenal. 1 Kings, chapter 10. 200 large shields, each made from 600 shekels of beaten gold. 300 smaller shields, each made from 3 minas of gold. 500 gold shields in total, hanging on the walls of a cedar forest inside a desert palace. A gold shield is useless in battle. Too heavy. Reflects light, reveals your position. Dents more easily than bronze. A soldier carrying a gold shield into combat would be dead within minutes. Solomon knew this. Every visiting king knew this. That was the point. Those 500 shields were a statement. I have so much gold that I can make 500 objects from pure gold that will never serve their intended purpose. Waste requires scarcity. I have no scarcity. When a foreign king saw the light from those windows, bouncing off 500 gold surfaces, ricocheting between 45 cedar columns, he didn't see weapons. He saw the end of any ambition he might have had. The house of the Forest of Lebanon was a declaration of war that made war unnecessary. But it was not the most powerful room in the complex. That room was smaller, quieter. At the end of 6 steps that nobody climbed without their hands trembling. The Hall of the Throne, also called the Hall of Judgment. Cedar from floor to ceiling. Heavy silence. And at the far end elevated, impossible to ignore the throne. The base, ivory, every centimeter covered in refined gold. Not a throne of ivory covered in gold, a throne of gold that happened to have ivory underneath. 2 armrests. Beside each armrest a lion. 2 lions flanking the seat. Then 6 steps leading up, and on each step, at both ends, another lion. 12 lions on 6 steps. 2 lions at the throne. 14 lions of solid gold in total, each one staring at whoever was climbing toward judgment. 1 Kings, chapter 10, verse 20. Nothing like it had ever been made for any kingdom. Not. It was impressive. Nothing like it. In any kingdom. Ever. When you were brought before the throne not as a guest, but as someone seeking judgment, you did not see Solomon first. You saw 14 gold lions. You saw 6 steps rising above you. And by the time your eyes reached Solomon himself, seated at the top, looking down between those lions, you had already been judged. Not by him,
please, Your Majesty,
by the
have
room.
mercy on my family.
The most famous
Please,
judgment in that hall.
grant us this boon.
2 women,
You knew.
1
You knew
living
this would happen.
child,
I never. I
each
tried to warn you.
claiming
It
the
wasn't
child
me.
was
Mine.
hers.
Give me what is mine. It's
No
gone.
witnesses.
She took it. We're too late.
No evidence. Solomon called for a sword, ordered the child divided. 1 woman said yes. 1 woman screamed no. And in that moment, the truth revealed itself without a single piece of evidence.
The throne is empty.
The text says the people
What
of
does it
Israel
mean?
feared the king because
cannot
they
be.
saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Fear, not admiration. Fear. Because that is what that Rome was designed to produce. If what you've seen in these first 2 chapters has given you something, a deeper respect for the God who gave Solomon all of his, take a moment right now. Like this video. Shared with someone who needs to go deeper than the surface. Subscribe. Because we are only halfway through. And the second half is where everything starts to break apart. Stay with me. There is a number in 1 Kings, chapter 11, that most people read past too quickly.
The fabric is
1,000.
exquisite, just as you promised.
700
She
wives
says
who
they
were
arrived this morning,
princesses,
straight from the Silk Road.
300
So
concubines,
precious.
and the Bible in a detail most commentators skip entirely
Thank you,
says
my
that
king.
Solomon loved them. Not tolerated, not managed, loved. That word matters, because it changes everything about what happened next. In the ancient Near East,
I agree to your
marriage
terms,
was
King.
the most binding treaty
And I to
available.
yours.
When a king
May this
gave
peace
his daughter
hold.
to Solomon, he was locking his kingdom into a relationship that could not be broken without dishonoring his own bloodline. His daughter was inside Solomon's walls. His grandchildren would carry Solomon's name. You do not go to war against the grandfather of your grandchildren. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. Each nation represented, each alliance sealed. The map of Solomon's political world was drawn not in ink but in marriages, a web of connections radiating outward from Jerusalem in every direction. Each thread a woman, each woman a treaty. This was the most sophisticated diplomatic
yes,
machine the
excellent.
ancient
To your
world had
help.
ever seen.
He's very pleased.
But then there is
Indeed.
the other part. The part the Bible insists on telling us. 1 Kings, chapter 11, verse 2. Solomon clung to these in love. Clung. That is a word of attachment, of need, of something that goes beyond strategy into something more human, more vulnerable, more dangerous. Solomon, the man who could have anything, needed to be loved back. And 1,000 women gave him 1,000 versions of that. 1,000 cultures, 1,000 languages, 1,000 sets of eyes looking at him not as a king but as a man. I
Bring more
think
silks
about what
quickly.
that palace
Food is needed
actually
here.
felt like from the
Make
inside.
way.
The noise. Ammonite spoken in one courtyard, Sidonian in the next, Egyptian in the wing built for Pharaoh's daughter. The food, the rituals, a woman from Moab preparing offerings for Chemosh, a woman from Sidon burning incense to Ashtoreth. All of it, every day, pressing against the edges of who he was. Of the 1,000 women, the Bible records the name of only one, Naamah. She was an Ammonite. Her name survived because she was the mother of Rehoboam the son who would inherit the throne. Out of 1,000 women, the one whose son became king was from the exact category of influence God had forbidden. History does not always move in the directions we plan. But the story of Solomon's women is not really a story about women. It is a story about erosion. Not sudden collapse. Not dramatic rebellion. Erosion. The kind that happens so slowly you don't notice until the
understand.
ground beneath you is
You have
already
my full
gone.
permission.
Year 1. Solomon allows his wives to
spirits,
practice
hear my
their
plea.
religions
Guide me
privately.
through the darkness.
They are far
Bless this
from
humble
home.
offering. Protect
He
my
loves
family.
them. What harm is there in a private altar in a private room? Year 5. The altars have become shrines. Some of the household staff have begun participating. Solomon attends once not to worship, he tells himself, but to honor the woman he loves. Year 10. There are high places on the hills outside Jerusalem, built with Solomon's own resources, dedicated to Chemosh and Molech and Ashtoreth. Year 13. Solomon himself is burning incense of those altars. The Bible compresses this into a few verses. But it happened over decades. One small yes at a time. One quiet compromise that seemed too small to matter. Until the sum of all those small compromises became a life that looked nothing like the man who had asked God for wisdom at the beginning. Next we follow the gold. Because before we can understand what Solomon lost, we need to understand what he had. One of those numbers you already know. 666. And it has nothing to do with what you think it does. 666. Most people hear that number and go immediately to Revelation. The mark of the beast. The most infamous sequence of digits in all of Scripture. But there is another place in the Bible where that number appears. And almost nobody talks about it. 1 Kings, chapter 10, verse 14. The weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents. Not a symbol, not a prophecy, an accounting entry. 666 talents, arriving every single year just from regular tribute. 1 talent weighed approximately 34 kilograms. 666 talents, roughly 22.5 metric tons of gold. Every year, just from tribute. The entire gold reserve of a mid-sized modern nation is typically between 20 and 50 tons. Solomon was receiving nearly that amount annually, not as his total wealth, as his yearly income. And the Bible adds, this was apart from what came from merchants and traders, apart from all the kings of Arabia and the governors of the land who also brought gold and silver. The 666 talents was the floor. Everything else was on top. Solomon maintained a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, a port on the Red Sea. Deep water trading vessels, built with Hiram of Tyre, crewed by Phoenician sailors who knew the open sea. Those ships went to Ophir. Nobody knows exactly where Ophir was. Arabia, Africa, possibly India. The text gives no coordinates, only the cargo. 420 talents of gold from a single voyage. 14,000 kilograms from one trip. And a second fleet sailed to Tarshish every 3 years, returning with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Apes and peacocks. Animals never seen in Jerusalem, loaded onto ships, transported across thousands of kilometers of open water, delivered to a landlocked city in the Judean hills because Solomon wanted them, and Solomon could afford them, and the ships had room for curiosities. This is what unlimited wealth actually looks like. Not the ability to buy necessities, not even luxuries. The ability to import living animals from the edges of the known world simply because you find them interesting. Then there was the Queen of Sheba. She had heard about Solomon, his wisdom, his wealth, his God, and she came to test him. She arrived with camels carrying spices, very much gold, and precious stones. Solomon answered every question. There was nothing hidden from him that he could not explain. And when she saw it all, the palace, the food, the servants, the ministers, the cupbearers, the offerings, the text says there was no more breath in her. No more breath. A queen. Wealthy, powerful, accustomed to luxury, standing inside Solomon's world and running out of breath. She gave him 120 talents of gold, the largest gift of spices ever recorded in Scripture. And she returned to her land. The result of all this accumulation, silver, ceased to have value in Jerusalem. 1 Kings, chapter 10, verse 27. The king made silver as common as stones in Jerusalem. All of Solomon's drinking vessels were gold. Every utensil in the house of the Forest of Lebanon was gold. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. Silver was the standard currency of the entire ancient world. Nations went to war over silver mines. Armies were paid in silver. And in Jerusalem, silver was gravel. It had never happened before. It has never happened since. But here is the thing about accumulation. It doesn't satisfy. It amplifies. The more you have, the more you need to maintain what you have. 1,000 women meant 1,000 sets of needs, 1,000 cultural expectations, 1,000 small requests that a king who loathed them could not easily refuse. The gold came in, and the compromises came in with it. Slowly, the man who had been given everything by God began to act as though he had earned it himself, as though the source of the blessing had become irrelevant to the enjoyment of what the blessing produced. That is the most dangerous moment in any life of abundance. Not poverty, not loss. The quiet moment when you forget where everything came from. And Solomon forgot. The gold was still coming in, but something far more valuable had already left. If this video has taken you somewhere inside Scripture you've never been before, share it right now with someone who needs this. It finds people because someone who cared enough said it. Be that person. There is a second moment when God speaks to Solomon directly. The first time was at Gibeon. Solomon was young. God appeared in a dream, asked for whatever you want. Solomon asked for wisdom. God gave it along with wealth and honor no king before or after would reach. That first conversation was full of open sky. The second conversation has no sky in it at all. 1 Kings, chapter 11, verse 9. God was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the God who had appeared to him twice. Twice. The Bible wants you to feel the weight of that. God had appeared to Solomon personally, twice. And Solomon, with both appearances in his memory, with the temple still standing on the hill above his palace, had turned away. And God spoke again, not with an offer, with the verdict. I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you. Tear, not transfer, not reassign. Tear. The same word used for ripping fabric, for an animal tearing flesh. Violent, irreversible, final. And then the grace, for the sake of your father David, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will give your son one tried. 1 out of 12. The diplomatic web of 1,000 marriages, the trade networks, the gold, the palace, the throne, all of it. His son would inherit not an empire but a fragment. That is the cost of a divided heart. While Solomon was still alive, the tearing had already begun. 3 adversaries rose against him. Hadad the Edomite, a prince who had grown up in Egyptian exile, waiting. Rezon of Damascus, a constant pressure on the northern border. And Jeroboam, one of Solomon's own officials, a man Solomon himself had elevated. A prophet found Jeroboam on a road outside Jerusalem, took off his new cloak, tore it into 12 pieces, handed 10 to Jeroboam, said, "God is giving you 10 tribes." Solomon tried to kill him. Jeroboam fled to Egypt, the same Egypt whose Pharaoh had given Solomon his first wife. The alliances Solomon had spent a lifetime building were already working against him. I want to say something the text doesn't say directly, but that I believe it is pointing toward with everything it has. Solomon was not a villain. He was a man who genuinely loved God, who had built the most magnificent house of worship the ancient world had ever seen. He was also a man who genuinely loved 1,000 women, who found it genuinely difficult to look at a woman he loved and tell her that her gods were not welcome in his home. He was a man caught between 2 real loves. And that is precisely what makes his story so devastating. The danger to your faith rarely comes from something you hate. It comes from something you love. The relationship that asks for one small accommodation. The success that requires one quiet compromise. The comfort that gradually replaces the hunger you once had for God. Solomon did not fall because he was weak. He fell because he was human. The book of Ecclesiastes is traditionally attributed to Solomon, written late in his life, after the palace, after the women, after the gold, after the altars on the hillside. The book opens with a line only someone who has had everything and stood on the other side of it can write. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. The Hebrew word is hebel, breath, vapor. The thing that appears for a moment and then is gone. Solomon looked back at 22 tons of gold per year, 1,000 women, a cedar forest and doors, 14 gold lions, and called it breath. He had placed the weight of his heart on things that could not hold it. And they didn't. Wisdom tells you what is true, but only a guarded heart can live it. Solomon built a palace that made silver worthless. He built a throne that no king on earth could copy. And then he built altars for gods that did not exist. Not because he stopped believing, but because he stopped guarding. That is the whole story. Not a story about a king who had too much. A story about a man who forgot that everything he had was held in trust, not owned, not earned, not permanent. By a God who had appeared to him twice, given him everything he asked for, and asked only for one thing in return. An undivided heart. In the end, the palace is gone. The gold is gone. The 1,000 women are gone. The 14 lions are gone. What remains is the question Solomon himself could not escape, written in his own words. in a book he left behind when everything else had already slipped through his fingers. What does a man gain from all his labor under the sun? I don't think that was rhetorical. I think that was a man who had the answer and was hoping, even at the end, that someone else would find a better one. If this video gave you something today, like it, share it, and subscribe. We go this deep every time. Guard your heart. Everything else flows from it.